On the night of February 7th, 2018, somewhere in the Syrian desert, over 250 men began marching toward their deaths, and not a single one of them knew it yet. They were hardened fighters, veterans of brutal urban combat, men who had survived Aleppo and Grozny and Deir ez-Zor. They had artillery, they had tanks, they had armored personnel carriers, and they were walking directly into the most one-sided massacre in modern military history. A battle that lasted 4 hours, involved some of the most advanced weapons systems ever built, and somehow barely made the news. Tonight, we're going to change that. Tonight, we are going to go deep into the desert darkness of eastern Syria, and we're going to reconstruct, minute by minute, the night American air power turned a confident mercenary column into a graveyard of burning steel. This is the Battle of Khasham. And if you think you already know this story, I promise you, you do not. Let us begin where all great military disasters begin. Not with the first shot, but with the decision that made the first shot inevitable. It is the winter of 2018. The Syrian civil war has entered a strange, fragmented phase. The Islamic State, once the dominant force across a territory the size of Great Britain, has been largely broken. Its so-called caliphate has been shattered by years of coalition airstrikes, Kurdish ground operations, and the grinding advance of multiple competing factions. But the collapse of ISIS has not brought peace to Syria. It has simply reshuffled the players on the board. And in the chaos of that reshuffling, something very dangerous has begun to happen on the eastern banks of the Euphrates River. On the western bank of the Euphrates, near the town of Khasham in Deir ez-Zor province, sits a modest but strategically critical piece of real estate. There is an oil and gas facility there, not huge by global standards, but enormously valuable in the context of war-ravaged Syria. The facility is operated by a joint American-Kurdish enterprise, protected by soldiers from the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, and quietly watched over by a small contingent of American Special Operations Forces. These Americans are there as advisors, trainers, and fire support coordinators. There are approximately 30 of them. And on the night of February 7th, 2018, they are about to need every single asset they can call upon. To understand why what happened that night happened, we need to understand the world of Russian private military contractors, specifically a shadowy and officially non-existent organization known as the Wagner Group. Wagner is not a normal private military company. It is not like the American security contractors you might think of from the Iraq War era. Wagner is something far more sinister, far more capable, and far more politically useful to the Kremlin. Founded in the early 2010s, linked directly to a man named Dmitry Utkin and funded through oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin, who himself had deep ties to Vladimir Putin, Wagner exists in a legal gray zone that gives the Russian state enormous flexibility. When Russian soldiers die in Wagner uniforms, the Kremlin does not have to send condolence letters to their families. The Russian government does not have to acknowledge their existence. They're ghosts, useful, deniable, and expendable. Wagner fighters have been operating in Syria since at least 2015, fighting alongside regular Syrian Arab army units in the brutal campaign to retake territory from ISIS and various rebel groups. They were experienced, they were motivated, and they operated under an understanding with Damascus that was as old as mercenary warfare itself. Fight for us, and you can share in the spoils. And the spoils that interested them most in the early months of 2018 were the oil fields on the eastern bank of the Euphrates. Here is where the story starts to develop the dimensions of a thriller, because what was about to unfold was not simply a military engagement. It was, at its core, a political miscalculation of almost incomprehensible proportions. Someone, and to this day the chain of command remains murky, deliberately obscured. Someone decided that the American presence east of the Euphrates was a problem that could be solved with firepower. Someone looked at 30 American Special Forces soldiers and their Kurdish allies and decided that a column of several hundred mercenaries backed by artillery and armor could simply roll over them, seize the oil facility, and present the world with a fait accompli. Perhaps they believed the Americans would not fight. Perhaps they believed the Americans would not respond with the full weight of their air power. Perhaps, and this is the most chilling possibility, they simply did not fully understand what they were walking into. They were about to find out. Deir ez-Zor province in February is cold at night. The Syrian desert does not have the romantic warmth that Western imagination sometimes assigns to it. The nights are bitter, the wind cuts across the flat terrain with nothing to stop it, and the landscape is broken only by dry riverbeds, sparse vegetation, and the occasional cluster of buildings that remind you this land was once part of one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. It was in this landscape, under a sky full of stars, that the Wagner Column began to assemble. The column was substantial. Estimates based on later reporting and declassified information suggest it numbered somewhere between 300 and 500 men. With them, they brought T-55 and T-72 tanks, Soviet-era armor that was old but still lethal against lightly armed opponents. They had artillery, howitzers capable of bringing devastating fire down on fixed positions. They had multiple launch rocket systems. They had armored personnel carriers packed with infantry. By any reasonable measure, this was not a raiding party. This was a military operation, planned with intent, equipped for victory, and moving with purpose towards objective. What the column did not know, what no one in that formation seemed to fully appreciate, was that from the moment they began to move, they were being watched. American intelligence assets, the details of which remain classified, had been tracking the buildup for days. The movement of armor and artillery in a war zone does not go unnoticed by the surveillance infrastructure the United States maintains in conflict zones. Satellites, drones, signals intelligence, human sources, all of it was feeding information into a picture that American commanders were studying with growing alarm, and if we're being honest, a certain grim professional interest. The American commander on the ground, a special forces officer whose identity has been protected, did what the doctrine demands. He got on the phone. He called his higher headquarters. He informed them that a very large, very well-armed column was heading directly toward his position, and he began the process of requesting fire support. What followed was a frantic 4-hour period of communication between the small American team, their SDF allies, and a chain of command that stretched from the Syrian desert back to the United States Central Command, and all the way through diplomatic back channels to the Russian military itself. This is a fact that is crucial to understanding the full dimensions of what happened at Khasham. Before a single shot was fired, American military commanders picked up what is known as the Deconfliction Hotline, a direct communications channel established between American and Russian military forces operating in Syria precisely to prevent accidental clashes between the two nuclear powers' military assets. They called their Russian counterparts. They told them, in plain language, that a column of armed forces was advancing on an American position. They asked the Russians to stop it. The Russian military officially denied any knowledge of the column. They stated that no Russian forces were in that area. Whether this denial was genuine, the result of the deliberate deniability built into Wagner's structure, or whether it was a calculated lie, remains one of the most debated questions in the analysis of this engagement. What is not debated is the result. The column kept moving. At approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, the column came within range and opened fire on the SDF and American position. Rockets and artillery rounds began impacting near the American perimeter. The engagement had begun, and now, the full machinery of American air power began to turn. Imagine you are the Special Forces commander in that moment. You have perhaps 30 Americans under your command. You have a larger number of SDF fighters, brave and experienced but lightly armed. Outside your perimeter, coming out of the darkness, is a column of hundreds of men with tanks and artillery. You're not panicked. You are trained for this. You have rehearsed this. You know exactly what to do. You get on the radio. You speak the words that activate a process that has no parallel in human history. And then you wait. You do not wait long. The first assets to respond were the ones already overhead, because American air assets are never truly absent from the skies over areas where American forces are operating. Among the platforms orbiting in the darkness above the Syrian desert that night was the AC-130 gunship. And we need to spend some time with this aircraft because it is, in the vocabulary of military aviation, something close to extraordinary. The AC-130 began its life as the Lockheed C-130 Hercules, one of the most reliable and versatile transport aircraft ever built. The idea of turning a transport plane into a gunship was born in the Vietnam War, when American commanders realized that what they needed over the jungle wasn't just fast-moving jets that arrived, dropped their ordnance, and left. They needed something that could orbit, that could loiter, that could provide sustained fire support for ground troops over extended periods. The result of this thinking was a series of increasingly powerful gunship variants that culminated in our era in the AC-130 Uspuki and the more advanced AC-130W Stinger II and AC-130J Ghost Rider. The AC-130J Ghost Rider, the most advanced variant in service in 2018, is a masterpiece of destructive engineering. Flying at an altitude where it is invisible to the naked eye, its left side bristles with weapons that can reach down out of the darkness with terrifying precision. It carries a 30mm Bushmaster autocannon capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. It carries a 105mm howitzer, an actual howitzer, the same class of artillery piece that ground forces tow behind trucks, mounted in the fuselage of an airplane. It carries precision-guided munitions, including the Griffin missile and the GBU-39 small-diameter bomb. And it carries one of the most sophisticated sensor and fire control systems ever installed on an aircraft, a system that allows its crew to see the battlefield below with extraordinary clarity, to identify targets, to track moving vehicles, and to place its fire with a precision that would have seemed like science fiction to the aviators of earlier generations. The AC-130 does not attack like a jet fighter. It does not make a fast pass, release its weapons, and pull away. It enters what is called a pylon turn, a sustained, banked orbit around the target area. And from this orbit, it fires continuously, walking its rounds across the target with the calm, methodical precision of a craftsman. For the men on the ground below, the experience of being targeted by an AC-130 is described by survivors as uniquely terrifying. Not the sudden violence of a jet strike, but a persistent, almost patient destruction that seems to follow you, that adjusts when you move, that does not stop. But the AC-130 was not alone in the sky over Khasham that night. And it is here that the story takes on its most remarkable dimension, because among the other assets that responded to the engagement was the F-22 Raptor, and the F-22 represents perhaps the single greatest leap in aviation technology since the jet engine itself. The F-22 Raptor is the product of one of the most expensive and demanding aircraft development programs in history. It was designed with a singular purpose: to achieve and maintain air superiority against any opponent in any environment under any conditions. Its characteristics border on the fantastical. Its radar cross-section, the measure of how visible an object is to radar, is approximately the size of a marble. To enemy radar systems, the F-22 is effectively invisible. It can cruise at supersonic speeds without using afterburner, a capability called supercruise that gives it an enormous range and endurance advantage over conventional fighters. Its sensors and avionics are decades ahead of anything operated by any other nation. Its maneuverability, the result of thrust vectoring engines and an advanced flight control system, exceeds that of any known opponent. The F-22 had entered service in 2005, and it spent much of its early career frustrating the people who flew it, because it was built for a kind of warfare, peer competitor air battles against advanced Russian or Chinese fighters that had not materialized. It was, in the parlance of its frustrated pilots, a Lamborghini being used to drive to the grocery store. Syria was supposed to change that, and at Khasham, the F-22 would demonstrate something that its designers had perhaps not fully anticipated, that a stealth air superiority fighter, equipped with the right munitions and operating in the right environment, could also be a devastatingly effective ground attack platform. The F-22s operating over Syria that night were armed with a weapon that perfectly suited the situation, the GBU-39 small-diameter bomb. The SDB, as it is known, is a masterpiece of miniaturization. It weighs only 285 pounds, but it carries a hardened, penetrating warhead and is guided by GPS to within a meter of its program target. Because it is small, an F-22 can carry 8 of them internally, maintaining full stealth while delivering a precision strike package that a decade earlier would have required multiple aircraft. The SDB wings out from the aircraft on small pop-out fins, gliding to its target in near silence, arriving with no warning whatsoever. For the Wagner column advancing through the Syrian desert, the next 4 hours were a descent into a kind of hell that defied comprehension. They had come prepared for a fight. They had armor, they had artillery, they had numbers. What they encountered was invisible death from a sky they could not see into, guided by sensors they could not jam, controlled by a command structure they could not disrupt. The AC-130s orbited above them and methodically worked through the column, their rounds detonating among the tanks and vehicles with the relentless patience of a machine that cannot feel fear and does not run out of ammunition quickly. The F-22s swept in from altitude, releasing their small-diameter bombs on specific high-value targets. The artillery pieces, the command vehicles, the armored concentrations at the AC-130s could not engage as efficiently. On the ground, inside the American perimeter, the Special Forces team was doing their own work. They were talking to the aircraft overhead through encrypted radios, providing targeting information, relaying the positions of threats, adjusting fire, doing the complex and demanding work of what is called terminal attack control, the art of bringing air power to bear from the ground. The SDF fighters with them were engaging the advancing infantry with their own weapons. The perimeter held. For every foot the column advanced, it paid a price that was rapidly becoming unsustainable. Let's talk about what it means for a military formation to be caught in this kind of engagement, because numbers and technical specifications only tell part of the story. A tank in the Syrian desert at night, under air attack, is not the fearsome weapon it appears on paper. Its crew is sealed inside a metal box, able to hear the explosions outside, but unable to see where they are coming from, unable to effectively engage an enemy they cannot detect. The infantry accompanying the tanks has no cover in the flat desert terrain, no way to disperse effectively, no air defense weapons capable of reaching aircraft operating at altitude. The artillery that seemed so powerful when the column set out is now a liability. It has been identified, it is being targeted, and its crews are dying trying to operate it under fire from the sky. Reports from the engagement pieced together from multiple sources, including statements from Russian journalists and later accounts in Russian media, describe scenes of extraordinary chaos and devastation within the column. Vehicles were burning. Men were dying faster than anyone had anticipated. The radio communications within the column, if they were being monitored, and there's every reason to believe they were, would have painted a picture of mounting panic, of officers trying to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly dissolving into carnage. There is a particularly chilling detail that emerged in later reporting about the Battle of Khasham, and it speaks to the surreal nature of modern warfare in the era of the deconfliction hotline and back-channel diplomacy. Even as the battle was ongoing, even as American aircraft were destroying the column, American military officials were continuing to attempt to reach Russian counterparts to communicate what was happening. The Russians continued to deny that any of their people were involved. The communication loop, Americans attacking, Americans calling Russians, Russians denying, Americans attacking again, continued for the entire duration of the engagement. This diplomatic dimension of the battle is as important as the military one. What were the Russians doing in those hours? Were the denials genuine? The result of a system specifically designed to allow the Kremlin to deny knowledge of Wagner's activities? Were they calculated? An attempt to see how far the situation would develop before the political cost of continued denial became too great? Were there people in Moscow watching this unfold in real time, making decisions about how to respond? We do not know. What we know is that the denial continued, and the battle continued, and the column continued to die. The engagement lasted approximately 4 hours. By the time it was over, in the early hours of February 8th, the column had been decisively destroyed. The attacking force had failed to reach the American and SDF position in any effective fighting strength. The vehicles that could still move were retreating, leaving behind a field of burning wreckage. The dead numbered, by most reliable estimates, somewhere between 100 and 200 men, though some estimates run higher. The wounded were far more numerous. Among the dead were an undetermined number of Russian nationals, Wagner mercenaries who had traveled from Russia to Syria under the fiction of deniability and had met their end in the Syrian desert, killed by American air power that their government officially denied knowing anything about. Let us pause here and sit with the scale of what had just happened, because I think it is easy to let the clinical language of military analysis obscure the human reality. More than 100 men died that night. Many of them were Russians. Not politicians, not oligarchs, not generals, but ordinary men who had taken a dangerous contract for a combination of money, adventure, and perhaps a kind of patriotic motivation that their country had carefully cultivated and then abandoned the moment it became inconvenient. They died in the Syrian desert, in the dark, thousands of miles from home, and their government spent months refusing to acknowledge that they had ever been there. The Russian media response to Khasham was a masterclass in information suppression. State-controlled outlets said almost nothing. The independent journalists who tried to report on the story, including those who worked for outlets like Fontanka.ru, which published some of the most detailed early reporting on the Russian casualties, faced enormous pressure. Families of dead Wagner fighters reported being pressured to sign non-disclosure agreements, to accept that their sons and husbands had died in ways that could not be officially acknowledged, to take compensation quietly and say nothing. The Russian government's official position, maintained for months, was that no Russian citizens had been killed in combat operations in Syria on that date. This silence is itself a story. Think about what it means for a state to possess the institutional capacity to absorb that level of human loss without any public acknowledgement. Think about the families, the mothers and wives and children who knew what had happened, who could not speak about it, who could not grieve publicly, who could not even receive the kind of hollow official acknowledgement that at least gives grief a shape. Wagner was designed precisely to create this kind of deniability, and Khasham demonstrated that the design worked. That you could lose 100 or more men in a catastrophic military defeat and face no domestic political consequences whatsoever. Because as far as official Russia was concerned, those men simply did not exist. The American response to the battle was almost equally striking in its restraint, though for different reasons. The Pentagon acknowledged the engagement relatively quickly. It is difficult to keep the destruction of several hundred men entirely secret, but the official statements were careful, measured, and notably lacking in triumphalism. There was no press conference with generals standing in front of maps. There was no presidential address. The engagement was described in the passive voice of bureaucratic understatement. Forces had responded to an attack. Air assets had been employed. The threat had been neutralized. The names of the American soldiers involved were not released. The specific aircraft and munitions used were not detailed publicly for some time. Why this restraint? Several explanations have been offered. The most practical is operational security. The United States had no interest in advertising the specific capabilities and tactics that had been employed, both to protect those capabilities and to maintain the uncertainty in the minds of potential future adversaries. A more political explanation is that both sides had incentives to de-escalate the confrontation. The United States did not want to trigger a larger crisis with Russia, and Russia did not want to formally acknowledge a catastrophic defeat that would have required an official response. The result was a kind of mutual silence, a tacit agreement between two nuclear powers to treat a significant military engagement as something that had, in an official sense, barely happened. But it did happen, and its implications rippled outward in ways that are still being felt. The Battle of Khasham changed the operating calculus for Wagner and for the Russian state's use of deniable proxy forces. The Wagner Group, as an organization, did not disappear. Far from it. In the years following Khasham, Wagner expanded dramatically, extending its operations into Libya, Mali, the Central African Republic, Sudan, and ultimately becoming a significant factor in the early stages of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But Khasham established a data point that could not be ignored, a data point about what happens when Wagner or forces like it directly engage American military assets. The answer, demonstrated with terrible clarity in the Syrian desert, was annihilation. Within the American military, Khasham quickly became a case study. It was studied at the Air Force's Weapons School at Nellis. It was analyzed in Special Operations Command Doctrine Development. It was used to illustrate the potential of integrated air-ground combat operations, the importance of rapidly establishing communications up the chain of command, the value of prepositioned air assets, and the psychological and physical devastation that can be delivered by the combination of persistent surveillance and precision fires. The engagement validated years of investment in capabilities in the AC-130 gunship program, in the F-22, in the training of joint terminal attack controllers, in the intelligence infrastructure that allowed American commanders to see the column forming before it ever moved. It also raised uncomfortable questions. If the column included Russian nationals, and if the Russian government was aware of their presence and their mission, then the Battle of Khasham was, in a functional sense, a direct military engagement between the United States and Russia, the first such direct engagement since the Korean War, when American and Soviet pilots clashed in the skies over the peninsula. The deliberate fog of deniability that shrouded the engagement prevented it from being recognized as such. But the underlying reality was that American weapons killed Russian citizens in a battle fought, at least in part, over Russian geopolitical interests. This is an extraordinary fact, and the studied casualness with which it has been absorbed by public consciousness says something important, and perhaps troubling, about how much we have normalized the gray zone conflicts of the 21st century. The Kurdish SDF fighters who fought alongside the Americans in that battle are rarely mentioned in the Western accounts of Khasham, but they deserve acknowledgement. These were men and women who had been fighting continuously for years against ISIS, against the Syrian regime, against Turkish-backed forces in other parts of Syria. They were fighting for a political project, for a vision of a Kurdish autonomous region in northeastern Syria that the international community has never fully supported and that remains precarious to this day. At Khasham, they held their ground under fire from a much larger and better equipped force, and they held it alongside Americans who had come to their country to fight a common enemy. The bond forged in that kind of shared danger is real, and the subsequent treatment of Kurdish forces by American policy, particularly the decisions made in 2019 regarding Turkey's military operations in northern Syria, cast a long shadow over the meaning of that partnership. Let's return to the aircraft themselves for a moment, because I want to give you a sense of what it was like to be on those planes that night, to be part of the crew or the pilot conducting this engagement. The AC-130 crew numbers in the range of 13 personnel, pilots, navigators, fire control officers, sensor operators, and gunners. These are not people who push buttons from thousands of miles away. They are flying in an aircraft over a combat zone, at altitudes that put them within potential range of man-portable air defense systems, conducting an engagement that has real-time consequences for real human beings below. The sensor operators are looking through high-resolution cameras at the scene on the ground. They can see, in detail, what is happening. They are making targeting decisions, identifying which vehicles to engage, watching the results of their fire in real time. This is psychologically demanding work in a way that is very different from the popular image of remote, antiseptic drone warfare. The F-22 pilots operating that night were flying an aircraft that, in some respects, was designed for a very different kind of mission. Air-to-air combat, the kind of engagement for which the Raptor was primarily built, involves adversaries who can fight back, who have their own radar systems, their own missiles, their own tactics. The ground attack role is different. You are not threatened by an enemy who can reach you at your operating altitude, but it carries its own weight. The decision to release a weapon that will kill people below you, even people who are attacking your comrades, is not a trivial act, and the men and women who make those decisions carry them. The deconfliction calls, the calls to the Russian military that continued throughout the battle, were being made by American officers who were simultaneously managing a combat engagement and trying to prevent the situation from escalating into something even more dangerous. There are not many professions in the world that require you to simultaneously fight a battle and conduct diplomacy with the other side, but that is what the officers in the American chain of command were doing in those hours. The cool professionalism required to perform that dual function, under those conditions, deserves recognition. Now I want to take you somewhere else for a moment, somewhere that the formal military histories and the tactical analyses do not usually go. I want you to think about what happened to the survivors of that column. Men who were alive at 10 o'clock that night and were still alive at 2 in the morning. Men who had watched their comrades die, who had hidden among burning vehicles, who had done whatever human beings do when the machinery of modern military force is turned fully against them. Some of them walked back across the desert. Some were evacuated by Syrian army units. Some made their way to local hospitals. And then, because they were Wagner, because they did not officially exist, they disappeared from the official record, absorbed back into the deniability machine that had sent them into the desert in the first place. Some of them spoke to journalists. The accounts that emerged, carefully anonymized, reported in Russian independent media at considerable professional risk to the journalists involved, described the engagement in terms that are difficult to read without feeling something shift in your understanding of what modern warfare actually is. These were not soldiers who had been defeated by superior infantry, not men who had lost a fair fight. They had been, in their own words, erased. The sky had opened up and death had rained down on them from something they could not see, could not target, could not fight back against. The technology gap between what they were equipped to do and what was being done to them was so vast as to be almost metaphysical. Several accounts describe men simply stopping, standing in the desert, no longer knowing what direction to run because every direction seemed equally likely to bring destruction. There's a particular kind of helplessness that comes from being on the receiving end of technologically overwhelming force. And it is a helplessness that democratic military powers have the luxury of rarely experiencing. The United States has not faced an adversary with genuinely comparable military technology since the Second World War. In every conflict since Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, the technology gap between American forces and their adversaries has been measured in generations. Khasham was a particularly pure illustration of what that gap means in practice. A controlled experiment conducted in a Syrian desert that produced results as clear and unambiguous as any laboratory study. The Battle of Khasham also illuminates the evolution of the AC-130 gunship and what it represents in the architecture of American air power. The gunship's role has changed significantly since Vietnam. In the early days, the gunship's primary purpose was relatively straightforward: to orbit above a target area and put a continuous stream of fire onto enemy forces. Modern gunships do far more. They carry advanced sensors that can detect and track targets through darkness, smoke, and adverse weather. They carry precision-guided munitions that allow them to engage specific targets within meters of friendly forces. They carry electronic warfare systems. They serve as communication relay nodes. They conduct intelligence gathering. In some configurations, they carry capabilities that allow them to participate in cyber operations against enemy systems. The AC-130 is, in many ways, the perfect illustration of a principle that runs through all of American military aviation. The principle that the most valuable thing an aircraft can provide is not just firepower, but persistent presence. A fighter jet can deliver enormous firepower, but it can only stay over a target area for minutes before its fuel state requires it to leave. A gunship can orbit for hours. For troops on the ground in a sustained engagement, the difference between a few minutes of air support and several hours of sustained air support is potentially the difference between survival and annihilation. At Khasham, the AC-130s orbited for the duration of the 4-hour engagement. They were there when the column started its advance, and they were there when the surviving remnants of the column turned and ran. Let us also talk about what Khasham revealed about the intelligence and surveillance infrastructure that made the American response possible. The United States does not fight blind. In any area where American forces are operating, the intelligence community maintains what is called persistent surveillance, continuous monitoring of the area using a combination of satellite imagery, drone reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and human sources. This surveillance infrastructure is one of the most expensive and sophisticated things the American government does, and its value is precisely illustrated by what happened in the days before Khasham. The column did not appear out of nowhere. It assembled, it moved, it prepared, and American intelligence tracked all of it. The decision to preposition air assets, to have the deconfliction calls ready to make, to have the terminal attack controllers in position to direct fires. All of this was possible because the intelligence picture gave American commanders hours of warning. Contrast this with the situation of the Wagner column, which was operating on the assumption that its movements were not being fully monitored, or on the calculation that the Americans would not respond with full force, even if they were. The intelligence asymmetry at Khasham was as decisive as the weapons asymmetry. The Americans could see everything. The Wagner column was effectively blind to the full picture of what it was walking into. In military terms, this is called information dominance, and it is one of the most important and least glamorous foundations of American military effectiveness. There is also something important to say about the role of the Joint Terminal Attack Controller, the JTAC, in the Battle of Khasham. In the American military's joint doctrine, the JTAC is the critical link between air power and ground forces. These are specially trained operators qualified to communicate with and direct aircraft in the employment of fires, who are embedded with ground units precisely to enable the kind of rapid, precise air support that decided the outcome of Khasham. The JTAC qualification is among the most demanding in the American military. It requires an extraordinarily detailed knowledge of aircraft capabilities and weapon systems, of radio procedures, of target location methods, of danger close procedures for bringing fire in near friendly troops. The JTACs operating with the Special Forces team at Khasham were performing under conditions that test all of that training. Under fire at night, managing multiple aircraft simultaneously, making rapid decisions about targeting that had direct consequences for the soldiers around them. The doctrine of close air support, of which the Battle of Khasham is an extreme illustration, is one of the enduring intellectual achievements of the American military in the post-World War II era. It took decades to develop, decades of painful lessons in Vietnam, in Somalia, in Iraq and Afghanistan, to build the communications systems, the training programs, the weapons, the aircraft, and the doctrine that allow American ground forces to call on air power with the speed and precision demonstrated at Khasham. On the night of February 7th, 2018, all of those decades of development paid off in 4 hours of darkness in the Syrian desert. What does Khasham mean for the future? This is the question that military analysts, strategic thinkers, and policymakers have been wrestling with since the battle. Several things seem clear. First, Khasham demonstrated that the use of proxy forces and deniable mercenaries does not provide meaningful protection against American military response when American forces are directly attacked. The fig leaf of deniability, the Wagner structure, the absence of Russian military insignia, the official denials, did nothing to alter the physical reality of what happened in that desert. American commanders responded to the threat they faced, not to the political fiction surrounding it. Second, Khasham illustrated the extraordinary effectiveness of precision air power when combined with quality intelligence and skilled terminal attack control. The casualty ratio in that engagement, hundreds killed on one side, 0 killed on the other, is not a normal outcome of combat, even when one side is technologically superior. It reflects a combination of factors coming together in near-ideal conditions: persistent intelligence, prepositioned assets, skilled operators, and an opponent with no effective counter to what was being done to them. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the future, Khasham raised questions about what happens when adversaries do develop effective counters. Russia has invested heavily in air defense systems. The S-400, the Panzer, man-portable systems, precisely because it has studied how American air power has been used and wants to deny America the kind of unopposed freedom of action that characterized Khasham. In a future conflict against a peer adversary, the conditions that made Khasham such a one-sided engagement would not exist. This does not diminish the achievement of the forces involved, but it does mean that Khasham cannot be read as a simple template for future operations. The Wagner Group itself, as we noted, did not cease to exist after Khasham. It grew, it spread, it fought in Libya and Africa, and eventually in Ukraine, where it suffered enormous casualties in the brutal attritional fighting around Bakhmut in 2022 and 2023. The arc of Wagner's story from Khasham to its eventual implosion, the mutiny led by Yevgeny Prigozhin in June 2023, the brief march on Moscow, Prigozhin's death in a suspicious plane crash 2 months later is one of the most dramatic stories in contemporary military history. Khasham was the first clear demonstration that Wagner's model had profound structural limitations. It would not be the last. For the American soldiers who were in that compound when the column came out of the dark, the Battle of Khasham was a night they will carry for the rest of their lives. These are men who trained for exactly this contingency, who rehearsed mass casualty attacks, indirect fire drills, call for fire procedures, and who, when the moment came, executed with the competence and composure that their training demanded. They did not know for certain, when the first rounds impacted their perimeter, whether this was a manageable situation or a catastrophe in the making. They could count the forces arrayed against them. They knew they were outnumbered and outgunned on the ground. What they had, in addition to their training and their courage, was the ability to reach up into the sky and call down a response that their opponents could not have fully imagined. There is something almost mythological about that. About 30 soldiers in a desert compound, surrounded and outgunned, reaching up through the night sky and summoning a kind of destruction that no army in human history could have matched until very recently. The warriors of every era have wished for something like this. The ability to call down precisely targeted, overwhelming force on their enemies from a medium their enemies cannot effectively contest. In the Syrian desert on the night of February 7th, 2018, that wish was fulfilled in the most literal possible sense. The Battle of Khasham deserves to be remembered not just as a military footnote, not just as a case study in air support doctrine, but as a moment that illuminated something fundamental about the world we live in, a world where the boundaries between state and non-state conflict are deliberately blurred, where deniability is a strategic tool, where technology gaps between military powers are measured in generations, and where 30 men with radios and air support can survive and prevail against a force 20 times their size. It is a story about the limits of proxy warfare, the reach of American air power, the human cost of mercenary ambition, and the strange diplomatic ballet that governs conflict between nuclear powers in the 21st century. And it is, above all, a story about what happens in the dark, in the Syrian desert, far from cameras and headlines, when the machinery of modern military force is called to account for itself. What happened in those 4 hours was not clean. It was not simple. It was not without moral weight. But it was, by any military measure, decisive. The column came out of the darkness. The sky opened up. And when dawn came over the Euphrates Valley, the world had quietly, barely noticeably, changed. This is the Battle of Khasham. This is the night the desert burned. And this is the story that the history books have not yet fully told.